In the rolling wheat fields of Nebraska, where the horizon stretches endlessly under a canopy of endless sky, Jake Thompson stood ankle-deep in debt and knee-deep in desperation. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his ancient John Deere combine harvester as he watched storm clouds gather on the horizon, threatening to destroy what little crop he had left. The bank notice crumpled in his shirt pocket felt heavier than the machinery beneath him. 3 generations of Thompson farming hung in the balance, and tomorrow's harvest might be their last. But when a mysterious woman in a broken-down sedan appeared at his gate with tears in her eyes and a story about her family's legacy farm facing the same storm, Jake made a decision that would change everything. How could lending his only harvester to a complete stranger result in a fleet of corporate jets landing on his dirt road just 48 hours later? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Thompson family farm as Jake emerged from the old farmhouse at dawn, his boots crunching on the frost-covered gravel. At 42, he carried himself with the steady determination of a man who had learned to find hope in the smallest signs of progress, even when the world seemed determined to crush that hope beneath its heel. The farm that had been in his family since 1892 now bore the scars of 3 consecutive bad seasons, each one chipping away at their reserves until there was nothing left but stubbornness and prayer. His daughter Emma, 16 and fierce with her mother's green eyes, was already in the barn checking on their remaining livestock. The sight of her moving between the stalls with practiced efficiency made his chest tighten with both pride and worry. She deserved better than watching her inheritance crumble away, deserved the chance to choose her own path rather than being forced to abandon the only life she had ever known. But college applications required money they didn't have, and every conversation about her future felt like admitting defeat. The combine harvester sat in the machinery shed like a sleeping giant, its red paint faded but its engine still strong. Jake had spent the better part of the previous evening working on its aging hydraulics, coaxing life from systems that should have been replaced years ago. The machine represented both salvation and burden, the only tool capable of bringing in their wheat crop, but also the most valuable asset the bank could claim if they missed another payment. 3 days remained until the wheat needed to be harvested, and the weather forecast showed storms rolling in from the west. Emma appeared in the shed doorway, her breath visible in the cool morning air. She carried 2 steaming mugs of coffee, a ritual they had maintained even through the hardest times. The coffee was cheap instant, but it was hot, and it was shared, and sometimes that was enough to start another day of fighting for their survival. "Dad," Mrs. Henderson called earlier, she said, settling onto an overturned bucket beside the combine. Her wheat is ready too, but her harvester broke down completely yesterday. She was wondering if we could help once we finish our fields. Jake accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his calloused hands around the warm ceramic. Margaret Henderson was a widow in her 70s who had been struggling to maintain her smaller farm since her husband passed 2 years ago. Her property bordered theirs to the east, and the Hendersons had been good neighbors for as long as Jake could remember. In better times, sharing equipment and labor had been a cornerstone of their rural community. But these weren't better times. "How many acres does she have left to harvest?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The Henderson farm was modest, maybe 200 acres of wheat, but every acre represented Margaret's ability to keep her land another year. Her late husband had been a meticulous farmer, and, despite her age, Margaret had maintained his standards with the help of seasonal workers and stubborn determination. "About the same as us," Emma replied. "Maybe a little more." "She sounded pretty desperate, Dad. Said if she doesn't get it in before the storms, she'll lose everything." Jake stared at the combine's worn steering wheel, calculating time and risk in his head. If they pushed hard, they could finish their own harvest in 2 days, maybe less if the weather held. That would leave barely enough time to help Margaret before the storms arrived. But every hour spent on someone else's land was an hour their own crop remained vulnerable. And if something went wrong with the harvester while working Margaret's fields, they could lose everything. The sound of gravel crunching under tires interrupted his thoughts. Through the shed's open door, they could see an unfamiliar car turning into their driveway, a silver sedan that had clearly seen better days. Steam rose from its hood, and it moved with the hesitant pace of a vehicle pushed beyond its limits. Jake and Emma exchanged glances as the car came to a stop near the farmhouse, its engine making concerning noises before falling silent. The woman who emerged from the driver's seat was perhaps in her mid-30s, professionally dressed but with the rumpled appearance of someone who had been traveling for hours. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had come loose, and her usually pristine business attire showed signs of dust and worry. She looked around the farmyard with an expression that mixed desperation with determination, clearly searching for someone who might be able to help. Jake set down his coffee and walked toward the visitor, Emma close behind him. Years of rural living had taught him to be both welcoming and cautious with strangers, especially those who arrived unexpectedly and in obvious distress. But there was something in the woman's bearing that suggested she wasn't a threat, just someone who had run out of options and was hoping for kindness from strangers. "Excuse me," she called out as they approached, her voice carrying a slight accent that Jake couldn't immediately place. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but my car overheated and my phone has no signal out here. I was hoping I could use your landline to call for help." "Of course," Jake replied, gesturing toward the farmhouse. "The phone's in the kitchen, but I should warn you, the nearest tow service is about 50 miles away, and they don't usually come out this far unless it's an emergency." The woman's composure wavered slightly at this news, and Jake caught a glimpse of the stress she was trying to hide. She pressed her lips together and nodded, following them toward the house with the careful steps of someone trying not to impose despite desperate circumstances. "I'm Jake Thompson," he said as they walked. "This is my daughter Emma. Welcome to Thompson Farm, though I'm sorry it's under these circumstances." "Elena Vasquez," she replied, attempting a smile that didn't quite mask her worry. "I'm actually trying to get to the Ramirez farm about 20 miles north of here. Do you know it?" Jake knew it well. The Ramirez family had been farming in the area for almost as long as the Thompsons, running a successful operation that specialized in organic wheat and heritage corn varieties. They were good people who had always been willing to help their neighbors, and Jake had borrowed equipment from Carlos Ramirez more than once during difficult seasons. "Sure do," Jake said, holding the kitchen door open for Elena. "Carlos and Maria are good folks. Family emergency?" Elena's carefully maintained composure finally cracked, and tears began to well in her eyes. She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her hands trembling as she reached for the tissue box Emma quietly placed before her. For a moment, the professional facade disappeared entirely, revealing a woman overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. "My grandmother," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She raised me after my parents died, and she's been trying to hold on to the family farm by herself since my grandfather passed 5. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Years ago, I've been working in Denver, sending money when I can, but yesterday she called and said the bank is foreclosing. Today is the deadline, and if she doesn't bring in this year's wheat crop, we lose everything." Jake felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the recognition of a story too similar to his own. The struggles of small family farms were universal, it seemed, and the specter of foreclosure haunted rural communities across the country. He glanced at Emma, who was listening with the intense focus of someone who understood exactly what Elena was describing. "The Ramirez place has been in their family for generations," Emma said softly. "I remember Carlos telling us about their heritage seeds, how they've been passed down for over 100 years. Elena nodded, wiping her eyes with the tissue. "That's exactly right. My grandmother has been trying to maintain those seed lines, but their harvester broke down 3 days ago. She's 78 years old, and she's been trying to harvest by hand, but there's no way she can finish in time. I drove all night from Denver to try to help, but I know nothing about farming, and now my car has broken down too." The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the old wall clock and the distant sound of wind moving through the wheat fields. Jake stared out the window at his own crop, golden and ready but still vulnerable to the approaching weather. In 3 days, those storms would arrive, and anyone who hadn't finished their harvest would likely lose everything they had worked for all season. "What kind of acreage are we talking about?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The Ramirez farm was larger than most in the area, a successful operation that had been built over several generations of careful stewardship and hard work. "About 800 acres, Elena replied. "I know it's a lot, but my grandmother thinks it's possible if we can get started today. She's already arranged for workers to help with the grain trucks and storage, but without a harvester, none of that matters." Jake's mind began working through the logistics, almost automatically. 800 acres would take at least 3 full days with a single combine. Maybe 4 if the grain was particularly heavy or if they encountered mechanical problems. That would mean starting immediately and working around the clock, racing against both the weather and the clock. It would also mean abandoning his own harvest, leaving his crop vulnerable to the same storms that threatened the Ramirez family. "Dad," Emma said quietly, reading the conflict in his expression. "The Ramirez family helped us that year when our planter broke during seeding season. Remember? Carlos drove his equipment over here and worked for 2 days straight to make sure we got our crop in the ground on time." Jake remembered that season well. It had been 4 years ago, during their first really difficult year when the previous winter had damaged several pieces of their equipment. Carlos had arrived unannounced one morning, having heard about their troubles through the network of farmers who looked out for each other. He had refused any payment, saying simply that neighbors helped neighbors when times were tough. The phone rang, startling them all from their thoughts. Jake answered it automatically, his mind still wrestling with the impossible decision Elena's request presented. It was Margaret Henderson, her voice tight with worry as she asked again about the possibility of getting help with her harvest. Jake found himself promising to call her back within the hour, another weight added to the growing burden of responsibilities and impossible choices. After hanging up, he turned back to Elena, who was watching him with the desperate hope of someone who had run out of alternatives. She had driven through the night to try to save her family's farm, and now she sat in a stranger's kitchen, dependent on the kindness of people she had never met. "Miss Vasquez," Jake began, choosing his words carefully. "I want to help you, I really do, but I need to be honest about our situation here. We're facing the same storms you are, and our own harvest isn't finished. We've got a neighbor who also needs help, and only one combine between all of us." Elena's face fell, but she nodded with the weary acceptance of someone who had been preparing for disappointment. "I understand," she said. "I'm sorry to have bothered you. Could I just use your phone to call for a tow truck, and maybe see if there's any other equipment rental in the area?" Jake looked out the window again, watching the wheat sway in the morning breeze. Each stalk represented a small portion of their survival, and leaving it unharvested would mean admitting defeat after 3 generations of Thompson farming. But he also thought about Elena's grandmother, working alone in her fields with hand tools at the age of 78, refusing to give up on the land that had sustained her family for generations. Emma's voice broke the silence. "Dad, what if we all work together? The Thompsons, the Hendersons, and the Ramirez family? Pool our resources and help each other?" Jake turned to his daughter, seeing in her expression the same stubborn optimism that had sustained farmers through countless seasons of uncertainty. It was an ambitious idea, fraught with risk and dependent on perfect coordination and favorable weather. But it was also the kind of cooperative spirit that had built their community in the first place. Elena looked between them, not daring to hope, but unable to completely dismiss the possibility. "That's very generous," she said carefully, "but I couldn't ask you to risk your own harvest for people you've never met." Jake found himself thinking about his grandfather, who had often spoken about the unwritten codes that governed rural life. Help your neighbors, share what you can, and trust that the favor would be returned when you needed it most. Those principles had built their community, but they had also been tested by years of economic pressure and agricultural uncertainty. The decision crystallized in his mind with sudden clarity. He couldn't save everyone, but he could try to save what mattered most: the connections between people who understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than themselves. "Miss Vasquez," he said, standing up and reaching for his keys, "let's go take a look at your grandmother's fields and see what we're dealing with. Emma, call Mrs. Henderson and tell her we're going to figure out a way to help everyone. And start checking the weather forecast for the next week, not just the next 3 days." Elena's eyes widened with disbelief and gratitude. "Are you serious? You'd really consider helping us?" Jake paused at the kitchen door, thinking about all the reasons this was a terrible idea, and all the reasons it was the only idea that mattered. Sometimes, he realized, the biggest risks were also the most necessary ones. "My dad always told me that a farm isn't just land and equipment," he said. "It's the connections between the people who work it and the communities that support it. If we can't help each other survive, then we're all going to fail separately." The drive to the Ramirez farm took them through 20 miles of Nebraska farmland, past fields in various stages of harvest and preparation for winter. Elena rode in the passenger seat of Jake's pickup truck, her broken-down sedan temporarily abandoned in the Thompson farmyard. She had spent the journey explaining her family's situation in greater detail, painting a picture of struggle and determination that felt achingly familiar to Jake. Elena worked as a data analyst for a renewable energy company in Denver, a good job that paid well but kept her far from the farm where she had spent her childhood summers. Her grandmother, Rosa Ramirez, had been the anchor of their family since Elena was 8 years old, providing stability and love after a car accident claimed both of Elena's parents. The farm had thrived under Rosa and her late husband Manuel's careful stewardship, but the combination of Manuel's death, rising costs, and several difficult seasons had slowly eroded their financial stability. "She's been so proud," Elena explained as they turned onto the gravel road that led to the Ramirez property. "She never wanted to ask for help, never wanted me to know how bad things had gotten. I only found out about the foreclosure notice because her neighbor called me yesterday morning." Jake nodded, understanding the fierce independence that often prevented farmers from seeking help, even when they desperately needed it. Pride was both a virtue and a curse in rural communities, driving people to work harder and persevere longer than seemed humanly possible, but also preventing them from accepting assistance that could make the difference between survival and failure. The Ramirez farmhouse came into view as they crested a small hill, a well-maintained white structure surrounded by outbuildings that showed signs of careful upkeep despite their age. The wheat fields stretched in all directions, golden and ready for harvest, but visibly untouched by machinery. In the distance, Jake could see a small figure moving slowly through the grain, and his heart clenched as he realized it was Rosa Ramirez, working alone with a hand scythe in a task that would take weeks to complete. Elena was out of the truck almost before it stopped moving, running toward her grandmother with tears streaming down her face. Jake followed more slowly, giving them space for their reunion while taking in the scope of the work that needed to be done. The wheat was beautiful, clearly the product of generations of careful cultivation and selection, but it was also extensive, covering rolling hills that disappeared into the distance. Rosa Ramirez was a small, wiry woman with silver hair braided down her back and hands that showed the calluses and scars of a lifetime spent working the land. She embraced her granddaughter fiercely, speaking in rapid Spanish that Jake couldn't follow but whose emotional content was unmistakable. When Elena switched to English to introduce Jake, Rosa's weathered face broke into a smile that transformed her entire appearance. "Mr. Thompson," she said, extending a dirt-stained hand with surprising strength. "Elena tells me you are considering helping us with our harvest. I cannot tell you what this would mean to our family." Jake shook her hand, feeling the honesty and determination in her grip. "Mrs. Ramirez, I need to be straight with you about what we're facing. We've got 3 farms that need harvesting, 1 combine harvester, and storms coming in 3 days. If we're going to make this work, it's going to require perfect coordination and a lot of luck." Rosa nodded seriously, her expression showing that she understood both the generosity of the offer and the magnitude of the challenge. "I have worked this land for 43 years," she said. "I know what the weather can do, and I know what it means to race against time. What do you need from us?" Jake looked out over the wheat fields, his mind already working through the logistics of moving equipment, coordinating workers, and managing the complex dance of bringing in multiple harvests simultaneously. It would require splitting his crew, working longer hours than was safe, and accepting risks that could easily backfire if anything went wrong. "First, we need to check the moisture content of your grain and figure out the optimal harvesting sequence," he said. "Then we need to coordinate with Mrs. Henderson and make sure we have enough trucks and storage capacity for all 3 operations. Most importantly, we need a backup plan in case the weather doesn't cooperate." Elena had been listening intently to their conversation, and now she stepped forward with an expression of determined resolve. "I want to help," she said. "I know I don't know anything about farming, but I can learn. I can drive trucks, help with coordination, whatever you need." Rosa looked at her granddaughter with a mix of pride and concern. "Mija, this is hard work, dangerous work. You are not used to this kind of physical labor." Elena's chin lifted with the same stubborn determination Jake had seen in Emma when she decided to champion a cause. "I've been sitting behind a desk while you've been fighting to save our family's legacy," she said. "It's time I did my part." Jake found himself smiling at the familiar dynamic between the generations, the tension between protection and empowerment that he navigated with Emma every day. He also recognized the transformation that was beginning in Elena, the shift from helpless observer to active participant in her family's survival. "All right," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let's start with a thorough assessment of what we're dealing with. Mrs. Ramirez, can you show us your storage facilities and loading equipment? Elena, I want you to start learning how to read grain moisture and quality. We're going to need everyone working at full capacity if this is going to succeed." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity as they surveyed the Ramirez operation and began planning the massive coordinated effort that would be required. Rosa proved to be a wealth of knowledge about her land, able to predict which fields would be ready first and which areas might present challenges for the combine. Elena threw herself into learning with the intense focus of someone who had found a purpose beyond her normal responsibilities. By late afternoon, they had developed a preliminary plan that would begin with the Thompson harvest, move to the Henderson farm, and finish with the largest Ramirez fields. It would require working in shifts around the clock, moving the combine between properties as efficiently as possible, and coordinating a complex network of trucks, storage facilities, and workers. As they prepared to return to the Thompson farm to begin preparations, Elena pulled Jake aside with an expression of gratitude that seemed almost overwhelming. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for this. You're risking everything to help people you barely know." Jake looked out over the wheat fields one more time, thinking about the generations of farmers who had taken similar risks to help their neighbors survive difficult times. The fields would still be there tomorrow, but the people who worked them might not be, and ultimately it was the people that mattered most. "Miss Vasquez," he said, using the same careful tone he employed when teaching Emma about the deeper responsibilities of farming. "Sometimes the most important crops aren't the ones growing in your fields. Sometimes they're the relationships you cultivate with the people around you. Those are the harvests that sustain communities through the hardest seasons." The evening sun was beginning to cast long shadows across the landscape as they drove back toward the Thompson farm, Elena quiet and thoughtful beside him. Jake knew that the real work was just beginning, and that the next 3 days would test everything he believed about community, cooperation, and the calculated risks that farming required. But for the first time in months, he felt something that had been missing from his life: the satisfaction of working towards something larger than his own survival. Tomorrow would bring the true test of their ambitious plan, but tonight there was still time to prepare, to check equipment, and to make the hundreds of small decisions that would determine whether their harvest coalition succeeded or failed. Jake pressed a little harder on the accelerator, eager to get home and begin the work that might save 3 family farms and preserve the connections that made their community worth fighting for. The Thompson farmyard was bustling with activity by the time they returned, Emma having spent the afternoon making phone calls and organizing the logistics that would be crucial to their success. Margaret Henderson had arrived with her grandson Tommy, a college student home for harvest season, who brought youthful energy and modern agricultural knowledge to their effort. The kitchen table had been transformed into a command center, covered with maps, weather forecasts, and hand-drawn charts showing the optimal sequence for their coordinated harvest. Mrs. Henderson, a spry woman in her 70s with the practical efficiency of someone who had managed a farm through decades of challenges, had brought detailed information about her grain storage capacity and the condition of her fields. Tommy had used his laptop to access real-time weather data and create digital maps showing the most efficient routes between all 3 properties. Emma had clearly appointed herself as the coordinator of their operation, and Jake felt a surge of pride watching her natural leadership abilities emerge under pressure. She had organized the information with the same methodical attention to detail that made her an excellent student, but now those skills were being applied to something that could determine the survival of 3 family farms. "Dad," she said as Jake and Elena entered the kitchen, "I've been talking to the grain elevator in town, and they can stay open late all week if we need them to. I also called Johnson's Trucking, and they can provide 2 additional grain trucks if we pay overtime rates." Jake nodded approvingly, recognizing that Emma had already thought through several challenges he hadn't yet considered. The logistics of moving grain from field to storage to market were complex under normal circumstances, and coordinating 3 simultaneous harvests would require careful planning and constant communication. Elena took in the scene with obvious amazement. clearly unprepared for the level of organization and community cooperation that had emerged in just a few hours. Rosa, who had followed them back to the Thompson farm to participate in the planning, was deep in conversation with Margaret Henderson, the two women comparing notes about their respective operations, with the easy familiarity of people who shared common challenges. "This is incredible," Elena said to Jake, her voice filled with wonder. In the corporate world, it would take weeks to coordinate something like this. Multiple meetings, committees, approval processes. Here, you just decide to help and make it happen. Jake smiled, remembering his own amazement when he first understood how rural communities could mobilize in times of crisis. The absence of bureaucracy was both a strength and a vulnerability, allowing for rapid response, but also depending entirely on personal relationships and individual commitment. "It's not always this smooth," he admitted. "But when people understand that everyone's survival depends on cooperation, it's amazing what becomes possible. The question is whether we can maintain this level of coordination under pressure." Tommy looked up from his laptop, where he had been creating a detailed timeline for their harvest operations. Based on the field conditions and weather forecast, he said, "I think we need to start with the Henderson farm tomorrow morning. It's the smallest acreage, and Mrs. Henderson's grain is testing at optimal moisture content." Margaret Henderson nodded agreement. "My wheat has been ready for 3 days," she said. "Another day or two, and we'll start losing quality, especially if we get the humidity that's forecast for later in the week." Jake studied the maps and charts scattered across the table, impressed by the thoroughness of their planning but also aware of how many variables remained beyond their control. Equipment failures, weather changes, or simple human exhaustion could easily derail their carefully coordinated effort. "All right," he said, making the decision that would commit them all to the ambitious plan. "We start at dawn tomorrow with the Henderson harvest. Emma, I want you coordinating communications between all 3 farms. Elena, you'll work with Tommy on grain truck logistics. Mrs. Ramirez, if you're comfortable with it, I'd like you supervising grain quality and storage decisions." Rosa straightened with obvious pride at being given a crucial responsibility. "I have been judging grain quality for 40 years, she said. "I will make sure nothing goes to storage that is not perfect." The kitchen fell quiet for a moment as the weight of their commitment settled over the group. They were embarking on something ambitious and risky, dependent on dozens of factors aligning perfectly over the next 3 days. But Jake also felt the energy and determination that had sustained farming communities through countless challenges, the belief that working together could overcome obstacles that would defeat individuals. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message, and her expression shifted to one of concern as she read it. "That's my supervisor," she said. "I was supposed to be back at work today, and I haven't even called in. I might lose my job over this." Jake felt a stab of guilt at the realization that Elena was sacrificing her own career security to help save her family's farm. The corporate world operated on different principles from agriculture, with less tolerance for family emergencies and unexpected absences. "You need to make that call," he said. "We can handle the planning from here if you need to drive back to Denver tonight." Elena looked around the kitchen at the maps and charts, at the faces of people who had committed their time and resources to helping her family. Then she looked out the window toward the darkening wheat fields that represented generations of her family's work and dreams. "No," she said firmly, putting her phone away without responding to the message. "Some things are more important than keeping a job. This is my family's legacy, and I'm not walking away from it now." Tommy grinned at her declaration. "Welcome to farming," he said, "where everything is more important than whatever else you're supposed to be doing." The laughter that followed broke some of the tension, but Jake could see the determination in Elena's expression that marked a fundamental shift in her priorities. She was no longer just a visitor trying to help. She had become a participant in the struggle to preserve something that mattered more than professional advancement or career security. As the evening progressed and their plans solidified, Jake found himself thinking about the risks they were all taking and the faith they were placing in each other. Margaret was trusting him with equipment that represented her life's work. Rosa was depending on strangers to save her family's farm. Elena was sacrificing her career for a way of life she had never fully embraced. And he was gambling his own family's survival on the belief that cooperation could overcome the obstacles that had been defeating them individually. But as he watched Emma work confidently with the adults, coordinating details with the natural leadership that reminded him so much of her mother, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Genuine optimism about the future. Win or lose, they were facing their challenges together, and that made all the difference in the world. The alarm clock's harsh buzzing cut through the pre-dawn darkness at 4:30 in the morning, but Jake was already awake, staring at the ceiling and running through the day's complex logistics one final time. The weather forecast remained stable for the next 48 hours, but storms were still predicted to arrive Thursday evening, giving them a narrow window to complete 3 separate harvests. Emma appeared in the kitchen as he started the coffee, her hair pulled back in a ponytail and her eyes bright with nervous energy. She had clearly spent time organizing her coordination materials, with a clipboard full of phone numbers, field maps, and timing charts that would help her manage communications between the 3 farms. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked, noting the careful preparation that suggested she had been awake for some time. "A little," she admitted, accepting the coffee he offered. "I kept thinking about everything that could go wrong, and trying to plan for contingencies. Tommy sent me some apps that farmers use for harvest coordination, and I spent half the night learning how they work." Jake smiled at his daughter's characteristic thoroughness, recognizing her mother's influence in the way she prepared for challenges by mastering every available detail. Catherine had approached her teaching the same way, never walking into a classroom without having considered every possible scenario and prepared materials for unexpected developments. The sound of vehicles arriving in their driveway announced the beginning of their coordinated effort. Through the kitchen window, Jake could see Margaret Henderson's pickup truck, followed by Tommy's small sedan and Elena's rental car, which had been delivered the previous evening after a tow truck finally retrieved her broken-down vehicle from their yard. Elena emerged from her car, looking determined but slightly overwhelmed, clearly operating on little sleep and high stress. She had changed from her professional attire into work clothes borrowed from Emma, and the transformation was striking. The polished businesswoman had disappeared, replaced by someone ready to work with her hands and learn whatever was necessary to help save her family's farm. Rosa arrived a few minutes later, driven by her neighbor who had volunteered to help with grain truck operations. Despite her age, she moved with the purposeful energy of someone who had awakened before dawn for decades, and her presence seemed to calm Elena's visible nervousness about the day ahead. "All right, everyone," Jake announced as they gathered in the kitchen for a final briefing. "We start with the Henderson farm, which should take us most of today if everything goes smoothly. Elena, you'll be riding with me in the combine for the first few hours, learning how the operation works. Emma will coordinate from here, managing communications and logistics. Tommy and Mrs. Ramirez will handle grain truck operations and quality control." Margaret Henderson nodded approvingly at the plan. "My fields are laid out in a simple grid pattern," she said, "which should make them good for training Elena before we move to more complex terrain. The grain trucks can access most areas easily, and my storage bins are close to the house." They loaded the combine onto the transport trailer, a process that required careful attention to weight distribution and securing mechanisms. Jake had performed this routine hundreds of times, but today the familiar tasks carried extra weight because so much depended on the equipment functioning perfectly throughout their marathon harvest effort. The Henderson farm occupied a picturesque valley about 15 minutes from the Thompson property, with rolling fields that caught the morning light in waves of golden grain. Margaret's late husband had planned the layout with an eye toward efficiency, and the fields were accessible by well-maintained farm roads that would make moving equipment between harvesting areas straightforward. Elena climbed into the combine's cab beside Jake, her eyes wide as she took in the array of controls and monitors that governed the complex machine. The cab was spacious and comfortable, designed for long days of operation, but the technology was more sophisticated than she had expected. "This is like the cockpit of an airplane," she said, studying the displays that showed everything from ground speed to grain, moisture content, to engine temperature. Jake began explaining the basics of combine operation as he started the massive engine and began the process of engaging the harvesting mechanisms. The machine responded with the satisfying rumble of well-maintained machinery, and Jake felt the familiar satisfaction of operating equipment that had been carefully maintained and properly prepared. "The key to efficient harvesting," he explained as they entered the first field, "is maintaining consistent ground speed while adjusting the internal mechanisms to handle variations in crop density and moisture content. Too fast and you lose grain, too slow and you can't finish before weather becomes a factor." Elena listened intently as Jake guided the combine through its first pass, watching the grain flow into the machine's hopper while chaff and straw were expelled behind them. The process was hypnotic in its efficiency. Generations of agricultural engineering distilled into a single machine that could accomplish in hours what would have taken weeks of hand labor. As the morning progressed, Elena proved to be a quick learner, asking intelligent questions about the combine's operation and gradually taking over some of the simpler controls under Jake's supervision. Her analytical background served her well as she began to understand the mathematical relationships between speed, efficiency, and grain quality that governed optimal harvesting. Tommy coordinated the grain trucks with military precision, timing their arrivals to coincide with the combine's hopper capacity and ensuring a steady flow of grain from field to storage. Rosa stationed herself at the unloading area, inspecting each truckload for quality and moisture content with the critical eye of someone who understood that small variations could affect storage and market value. Emma's voice crackled regularly over the radio, providing updates on weather conditions, coordinating with the grain elevator in town, and managing the dozen small logistics that kept their operation running smoothly. Jake found himself impressed by her natural aptitude for crisis management, recognizing leadership qualities that would serve her well, regardless of whether she chose to continue farming. By noon, they had completed nearly half of Margaret's acreage, and the operation was proceeding more smoothly than Jake had dared to hope. The grain quality was excellent, the weather was holding, and their team was working together with the kind of seamless cooperation that usually took months to develop. During their lunch break, gathered around Margaret's kitchen table with sandwiches and coffee, Elena surprised everyone by pulling out her laptop and showing them a detailed spreadsheet she had created to track their progress. "I've been calculating our efficiency rates and projected completion times," she explained, displaying charts that showed their actual performance against the original timeline. "If we can maintain this pace, we'll finish Mrs. Henderson's harvest by evening and be ready to start on our farm tomorrow morning." Margaret beamed with pride at seeing her grain safely harvested and her farm's survival secured for another year. "You people are miracle workers," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was lying awake last night wondering if I was going to lose everything my husband and I built together." Jake felt the familiar satisfaction that came from helping a neighbor through a crisis, but he also understood that their biggest challenges still lay ahead. The Henderson farm had been the smallest and simplest of their 3 harvests, and the pressure would only increase as they moved to larger, more complex operations. Elena's phone had been buzzing regularly throughout the day with calls and messages from her Denver office, but she had been ignoring them to focus on the harvest. During lunch, she finally checked her messages and found 17 missed calls from her supervisor and a series of increasingly urgent emails demanding an explanation for her absence. "I need to make this call," she said quietly, stepping outside onto Margaret's porch. Through the open door, the others could hear fragments of a tense conversation as Elena tried to explain her situation to someone who clearly didn't understand or appreciate the urgency of saving a family farm. When she returned to the kitchen, her face was pale but determined. "I've been placed on unpaid leave pending a disciplinary review," she announced. Apparently, family emergencies don't qualify as acceptable reasons for missing work without proper notice in the renewable energy sector. Jake felt a stab of guilt at the realization that Elena was sacrificing her career for their harvest effort. But before he could speak, Rosa placed a weathered hand on her granddaughter's shoulder. "Mija," Rosa said firmly, "some things are more important than any job. This land has supported our family for generations. It will still be here long after that company in Denver has forgotten your name." Elena squared her shoulders, and Jake saw in her expression the same stubborn determination that had sustained Rosa through decades of agricultural challenges. The corporate world might operate on different principles, but Elena was discovering that family loyalty and community connection could provide their own form of security. Tommy looked up from his laptop, where he had been monitoring weather forecasts. "We've got a slight change in the storm timing," he announced. "The front is moving faster than predicted, which means we might only have until Wednesday evening instead of Thursday morning." The news sent a ripple of concern through the group, but Jake found himself oddly calm as he recalculated their timeline. Pressure was nothing new in farming, and the tighter deadline would simply require them to work more efficiently and accept even less margin for error. "That means we need to finish our harvest tomorrow and start on the Ramirez farm tomorrow evening," he said. "It's aggressive, but possible if we maintain our current pace and avoid any major equipment problems." Elena nodded with new resolve. "Then we'd better get back to work. My grandmother didn't spend her life building that farm just to watch it get lost. Because I was afraid of a little overtime, the afternoon proceeded with the same efficient rhythm they had established in the morning. But Jake noticed subtle changes in their team dynamics. Elena was becoming more confident with the combine's controls, taking over larger portions of the operation while asking fewer questions about basic procedures. Tommy had developed an almost telepathic communication with Rosa about grain truck timing, and their coordination was eliminating the small delays that had characterized the morning's work. Emma's radio updates were becoming more sophisticated as well, incorporating real-time data about market prices, storage availability, and transportation logistics that went beyond simple coordination. Jake realized that his daughter was developing genuine expertise in agricultural operations management, skills that would serve her well whether she chose to continue farming or pursue other career paths. As the sun began to set over Margaret's fields, they completed the final pass of her harvest, the combine's hopper emptying into the last grain truck of the day. Margaret stood at the edge of the field watching the process with tears streaming down her face, overcome by the realization that her farm would survive another year. The celebration was brief but heartfelt, with Margaret insisting that everyone stay for dinner as a small token of her gratitude. As they gathered around her dining room table, sharing a meal of pot roast and vegetables from her garden, Jake felt the deep satisfaction that came from completing difficult work successfully while helping a neighbor in need. But even as they celebrated the day's success, everyone was aware that their biggest challenges still lay ahead. The Thompson and Ramirez harvest would be larger and more complex, requiring everything they had learned during the day while maintaining the same level of precision and efficiency. Margaret pressed a check into Jake's hand as they prepared to leave, payment for the custom harvesting work that represented a significant portion of her farm's annual income. Jake initially tried to refuse the payment, but Margaret was insistent that their work deserved proper compensation. "You're running a business, not a charity," she said firmly. "If this harvest cooperative is going to succeed, everyone needs to be paid fairly for their contributions." As they loaded the combine back onto the transport trailer for the move to the Thompson farm, Elena surprised Jake by asking if she could drive one of the grain trucks during tomorrow's harvest. She had been observing Tommy's techniques throughout the day and felt confident that she could handle the responsibility. "I want to contribute more than just riding along and asking questions," she explained. "My grandmother is depending on all of us, and I need to do my part." Jake appreciated Elena's determination to become a full participant rather than just an observer, and her willingness to take on additional responsibility demonstrated the kind of commitment that made Harvest Cooperative successful. Tommy agreed to provide her with a brief training session before they started work the next morning. The drive back to the Thompson farm was quiet, everyone exhausted from the long day but satisfied with their progress. Jake used the time to mentally prepare for the next day's work, which would involve harvesting his own fields while maintaining the same level of efficiency they had achieved at the Henderson farm. Emma rode beside him in comfortable silence, occasionally making notes on her coordination clipboard but mostly just processing the day's experiences. Jake could see that she was beginning to understand the broader implications of their harvest cooperative, recognizing how individual actions could have ripple effects throughout their agricultural community. "Dad," she said as they turned into their driveway, "I've been thinking about college applications and what I want to study. After today, I'm starting to think that agricultural business management might be more interesting than I originally thought." Jake felt a complex mix of emotions at Emma's words. Part of him was thrilled that she was developing genuine interest in agriculture, but he also wanted to ensure that she was choosing her own path rather than feeling obligated to continue the family farming tradition. "That's worth exploring," he said carefully. "But remember that you've got time to consider all your options." Today was exciting, but farming also involves a lot of routine work that isn't nearly as dramatic as coordinating emergency harvests. Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I know, but there's something appealing about work that has such clear connections to helping people and building communities. In a lot of careers, you spend your time managing abstract problems that don't seem to matter to anyone in particular." As they settled into the farmhouse for the evening, Jake reflected on the changes that a single day had brought to their lives. Emma was discovering new possibilities for her future, Elena was reconnecting with her agricultural heritage, and their small farming community was demonstrating the kind of cooperation that had sustained rural areas through countless challenges. But tomorrow would bring the real test of their harvest cooperative, as they attempted to bring in the Thompson crop, while maintaining the same level of efficiency and teamwork they had achieved during their first day. Jake fell asleep that night with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation, knowing that the next 2 days would determine whether their ambitious plan succeeded or failed. The second day dawned clear and cool, with the kind of perfect harvesting weather that farmers dream about but rarely experience during critical periods. Jake was awake before his alarm, reviewing the field maps and equipment checklists that would guide their work on the Thompson farm. Their wheat was ready, testing at optimal moisture content and quality levels that promised good market prices if they could get it harvested and stored properly. Elena arrived early, having spent the evening studying grain truck operations and practicing with Tommy until she felt confident in her abilities. She wore borrowed work clothes and boots that were still too big for her, but her expression showed the determined focus of someone who had committed fully to the task ahead. Rosa came with her neighbor again, but this time she brought several containers of homemade breakfast burritos and a thermos of strong coffee that she distributed to the team with the efficiency of someone who had been feeding farm crews for decades. The gesture was small but significant, demonstrating how the Harvest Cooperative was evolving into something more than a simple business arrangement. Tommy had arrived even earlier, and was already performing the detailed equipment checks that would ensure their combine operated flawlessly throughout the long day ahead. Jake watched approvingly as the young man methodically tested hydraulic systems, lubricated critical components, and verified that all safety systems were functioning properly. Emma had transformed the kitchen into an even more sophisticated command center, with multiple phones, a laptop computer, and detailed charts showing grain elevator schedules, trucking availability, and real-time market prices. She had clearly spent time researching agricultural logistics and was prepared to manage complex coordination challenges that went beyond simple communication. "All right, everyone," Jake announced as they gathered for a final briefing. "Today we're harvesting about 500 acres of wheat, which should take us most of the day if we maintain yesterday's pace. The good news is that our fields are laid out efficiently for combine work. The challenge is that we're working with a tighter timeline because of the weather forecast." Lena raised her hand like a student in a classroom, a gesture that made Rosa smile with grandmother's pride. "I've been thinking about efficiency improvements based on yesterday's operation," she said. "If we can reduce the turnaround time at the grain bins by even 2 minutes per load, we could save almost an hour over the course of the day." Jake was impressed by Elena's analytical approach to their work, recognizing that her corporate experience with process optimization could provide valuable insights for agricultural operations. The combination of traditional farming knowledge and modern efficiency techniques was exactly the kind of innovation that could help small farms compete in an increasingly challenging marketplace. Tommy nodded agreement with Elena's suggestion. "I've been mapping the most efficient routes between fields and storage areas," he said, displaying a detailed diagram on his laptop. "If we coordinate the combine's movement with grain truck positioning, we can minimize the dead time when equipment is moving but not actually harvesting." Rosa listened to their technical discussion with the patient attention of someone who understood that younger generations brought new perspectives to old challenges. When they finished outlining their efficiency improvements, she added her own practical wisdom to their planning. "In my experience," she said, "the most important thing is maintaining steady progress rather than trying to work too fast. Equipment breaks down when people rush, and repairs always take longer than the time you were trying to save." Jake appreciated Rosa's reminder that sustainable efficiency required balancing speed with careful attention to equipment maintenance and safety procedures. The Harvest Cooperative would fail if they damaged the combine or injured someone while trying to meet their aggressive timeline. As they moved the equipment to the first Thompson field, Jake felt the familiar excitement that came with beginning his own harvest after months of preparation and worry. This wheat represented his family's financial survival for another year, and seeing it safely stored would remove a weight that had been pressing on his shoulders since planting season. Elena took her position in the combine cab with noticeably more confidence than she had shown the previous day, and Jake was pleased to see how quickly she had absorbed the complexities of harvester operation. Her questions were more sophisticated now, focusing on optimization techniques rather than basic procedures. The morning progressed smoothly, with their improved efficiency measures proving effective at reducing delays and maximizing the time spent actually harvesting grain. Elena's grain truck driving was competent if not yet expert, and her determination to master every aspect of the operation was evident in her careful attention to Tommy's coaching. Emma's coordination from the farmhouse command center was becoming genuinely impressive, as she juggled communications with grain elevators, trucking companies, and equipment suppliers while monitoring weather forecasts and market conditions. Jake realized that his daughter was developing skills that would be valuable in any number of career paths, agricultural or otherwise. As they broke for lunch, Jake received an unexpected phone call from Carlos Ramirez, Rosa's son and Elena's uncle, who was driving from California where he worked as an agricultural engineer for a large farming corporation. Carlos had taken emergency leave from his job and was racing across the country to help with the family farm crisis. "I should be there by evening," Carlos said over the phone. "I'm bringing some equipment modifications that might help with the harvest efficiency, and I've got contacts in the grain marketing business who might be able to help with sales logistics." The news of Carlos's impending arrival lifted everyone's spirits, particularly Rosa, who had been worried about the physical demands that the large Ramirez harvest would place on their small crew. Carlos brought both technical expertise and additional manpower that could make the difference between success and failure during their final day of coordinated harvesting. Elena was visibly emotional about her uncle's decision to risk his own career to help save the family farm, and Jake could see that the harvest cooperative was becoming something larger than any of them had originally envisioned. What had started as a simple equipment sharing arrangement was evolving into a network of family and community connections that transcended individual business interests. The afternoon brought their first significant challenge when the combine's grain elevator system began making concerning noises that suggested potential mechanical problems. Jake immediately stopped the machine and began diagnosing the issue, while Tommy and Elena waited anxiously for his assessment. After 20 minutes of careful inspection, Jake determined that the problem was a worn bearing in the elevator drive system that could be replaced with parts he had in his shop. The repair would take about an hour, but it was essential to prevent a complete breakdown that could derail their entire operation. Elena volunteered to drive to town for additional replacement parts while Jake and Tommy worked on the repair, demonstrating her growing confidence with agricultural equipment and logistics. Her willingness to take initiative and solve problems independently showed how much she had changed during just 2 days of intensive farm work. Rosa supervised the repair process with the keen interest of someone who understood that equipment maintenance was crucial to farming success. She asked intelligent questions about the combine's mechanical systems and shared stories about equipment challenges she and her late husband had faced during their decades of farming. The repair was completed successfully, and they resumed harvesting with only a slight delay in their schedule. Jake was pleased to see that their team had handled the crisis calmly and efficiently, working together to solve the problem rather than allowing stress to disrupt their cooperation. As evening approached and they completed the final passes through the Thompson wheat fields, Jake felt the deep satisfaction that came with successfully bringing in his family's crop. The grain quality was excellent, the yields were better than expected, and their financial situation had improved significantly with the completion of their harvest. But even as they celebrated this success, everyone was aware that their most challenging day still lay ahead. The Ramirez farm was the largest of their 3 operations, with complex terrain and fields that would test both their equipment and their organizational skills. Carlos Ramirez arrived just as they were finishing the day's work, driving a pickup truck loaded with specialized agricultural equipment and towing a trailer full of grain handling supplies. He was a tall, lean man in his 40s with the confident bearing of someone who had spent his career solving complex agricultural engineering problems. His reunion with Rosa and Elena was emotional, and Jake could see the relief in Rosa's eyes at having her son present for the final phase of their farm-saving effort. Carlos brought not only additional expertise and manpower, but also the kind of family support that made difficult challenges feel more manageable. After introductions and a briefing on their progress so far, Carlos surprised everyone by announcing that he had arranged for additional equipment support from his corporate contacts. A second combine harvester would arrive early the next morning, along with experienced operators who would work alongside their team to complete the Ramirez harvest in record time. "This changes everything," Elena said excitedly. "With 2 combines working simultaneously, we might actually finish with time to spare before the storms arrive." Jake appreciated Carlos's resourcefulness, but he also understood that managing 2 combines and their associated grain handling equipment would require even more sophisticated coordination than they had achieved so far. The success of their final day would depend on their ability to scale up their operations without losing the teamwork and efficiency they had developed. As they gathered around the Thompson kitchen table for dinner and final planning, Jake looked around at the faces of people who had become far more than neighbors or business partners. Emma was confidently discussing logistics with Carlos, drawing on expertise she had developed over just 2 days of intensive learning. Elena was transformed from the desperate woman who had appeared at their gate, now fully engaged as an equal participant in saving her family's legacy. Rosa sat quietly observing the planning discussion, but Jake could see the pride and gratitude in her expression as she watched her family and their new friends working together to solve what had seemed like an impossible challenge. Tommy was sketching equipment positioning diagrams with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a genuine passion for agricultural operations. The weather forecast remained stable through the next afternoon, giving them a narrow but adequate window to complete the Ramirez harvest before the predicted storms arrived. With 2 combines working together and their proven coordination systems, they had a realistic chance of bringing in all the grain safely and securing the survival of 3 family farms. As the evening wound down and people began departing for home, Elena lingered to help with cleanup and express her gratitude one more time for the risks everyone was taking to help her family. "Mr. Thompson," she said as they loaded the dishwasher together, "I want you to know that this experience has changed my life in ways I'm only beginning to understand. I came here thinking about farming as something from my past, but now I'm wondering if it might be part of my future." Jake smiled at Elena's reflection, recognizing the transformation that often occurred when people reconnected with agricultural work and rural community life. The combination of meaningful work, clear purpose, and strong social connections had a way of clarifying priorities and revealing possibilities that weren't apparent in other environments. "The land has a way of calling people home," he said. "Your grandmother never lost faith that you would find your way back to what matters most." As Elena drove away into the gathering darkness, Jake stood in his farmyard looking up at the stars that were becoming visible in the clear sky. Tomorrow would bring their final test, the culmination of 3 days of intensive cooperation and shared risk. But, regardless of the outcome, Jake knew that they had already succeeded in building something valuable, a network of relationships and mutual support that would strengthen their community long after the harvest was complete. Emma appeared beside him, following his gaze toward the stars. "Dad?" she said quietly. "I think I'm beginning to understand what Mom meant when she talked about work that makes a difference in people's lives." Jake put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, grateful for the wisdom and maturity she was developing through their shared challenges. Tomorrow would test everything they had learned about cooperation, efficiency, and the calculated risks that farming required. But tonight there was quiet satisfaction in work well done and anticipation for the final chapter of their remarkable harvest cooperative. The third and final day of their harvest cooperative dawned with an edge of urgency that everyone felt as soon as they saw the western sky. While the weather remained clear overhead, dark clouds were building on the horizon, a visual reminder that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. The storm front was still hours away, but it served as motivation for the team to maintain their focus and efficiency throughout what would be their most challenging day. Carlos had spent the early morning hours setting up the second combine harvester and coordinating with the experienced operators who had driven through the night to join their effort. The additional equipment transformed their operation from a small-scale cooperative into something resembling a commercial harvest crew, complete with multiple machines working in coordination across the expansive Ramirez fields. Elena was up before dawn, reviewing the field maps and coordination protocols that would govern their 2-combine operation. Her transformation over the past 3 days was remarkable. From a corporate analyst who knew nothing about farming to someone who could discuss grain, moisture content, and harvesting efficiency with genuine expertise. Rosa moved through the morning preparations with calm efficiency, preparing a substantial breakfast for the expanded crew, while mentally reviewing the characteristics of each field they would harvest. Her knowledge of the land was encyclopedic, accumulated through decades of careful observation and intimate familiarity with every acre of the family farm. Emma had evolved into a genuine operations manager, coordinating communications between multiple teams while monitoring weather conditions, equipment status, and grain market fluctuations. Her command center had expanded to include radio communications with both combine operators and a network of grain trucks that would be working throughout the day. The Ramirez farm presented more complex challenges than either of the previous harvests. with rolling terrain that required careful attention to combine positioning and fields that varied significantly in grain density and maturity. Carlos had prepared detailed maps showing the optimal harvesting sequence, designed to maximize efficiency while ensuring that both combines could work simultaneously without interfering with each other. Jake took the primary combine into the first field as the sun rose, with Elena riding beside him to continue her education in harvester operation. The second combine, operated by Carlos and an experienced crew member from his corporate contacts, began working a parallel section of the same field, and their coordination was immediately tested by the need to share grain truck access and unloading areas. The complexity of managing two harvesting operations simultaneously became apparent within the first hour, as grain trucks had to be precisely scheduled to avoid delays and conflicts between the combines. Emma's coordination skills were put to the ultimate test as she juggled communications with multiple operators, while ensuring that grain flow remained steady and efficient. Tommy had been assigned to work with the second combine crew, bringing his detailed knowledge of local logistics and his developing expertise in grain handling operations. Rosa positioned herself at the central grain storage area, where she could monitor quality from both combines while directing truck traffic and storage decisions. As the morning progressed, their two-combine system began to find its rhythm, with both machines working efficiently while avoiding the coordination problems that could have slowed their progress. Elena had become confident enough with combine operation that Jake was able to give her responsibility for significant portions of the harvesting while he focused on overall coordination and equipment monitoring. The weather continued to hold, but everyone was aware of the storm clouds building steadily on the western horizon. Carlos maintained regular communication with weather services and provided updates on the storm's progress, allowing them to adjust their schedule and priorities as conditions changed. During their lunch break, taken in shifts to maintain continuous harvesting, Elena received another phone call from her Denver office. This time, however, the conversation was different. Her supervisor had been contacted by several colleagues who had seen social media posts about the Harvest Cooperative, and there was growing interest in Elena's story from the company's public relations department. They want to feature our Harvest Cooperative in their next sustainability report, Elena explained to the group with obvious amazement. Apparently, our story fits their narrative about renewable energy companies supporting rural communities and sustainable agriculture. Jake found it ironic that Elena's corporate employer was now interested in the same family farm emergency that had nearly cost her job just 3 days earlier. But he also recognized that the publicity could be valuable for promoting the kind of cooperative farming arrangements that had made their success possible. More importantly, Elena continued, they've offered me a promotion to head their new rural sustainability initiative, based partly on the expertise I've developed during this harvest. I would be working to connect renewable energy projects with agricultural communities. Rosa beamed with pride at her granddaughter's news, but Elena's expression was thoughtful rather than celebratory. Jake could see that she was weighing the corporate opportunity against the deeper connections she had discovered during her time on the farm. The afternoon brought their most intense period of work, as both combines pushed to complete the remaining acreage before the approaching storm arrived. The coordination between teams had become seamless, with grain trucks flowing efficiently between harvest areas and storage facilities, while maintaining the quality standards that Rosa enforced at every delivery. Elena had progressed to the point where she could operate the combine independently for extended periods, freeing Jake to move between machines and provide oversight for the overall operation. Her transformation from nervous observer to competent operator demonstrated the kind of rapid learning that agricultural work could facilitate when people were motivated by genuine necessity. As the storm clouds moved closer and the wind began to pick up, both combines accelerated their pace while maintaining the precision necessary for optimal grain recovery. The pressure was intense, but their teams had developed the kind of trust and communication that allowed them to work efficiently under stress. Tommy's radio voice cut through the engine noise with an urgent update about the storm's timing. According to the latest Weather Service reports, they had perhaps 2 hours before the first rain arrived, with heavy precipitation and potentially damaging winds following shortly afterward. The news spurred everyone to even greater efficiency, with both combines working at maximum safe speed while grain trucks maintained a steady flow between field and storage. Emma coordinated the complex logistics with calm professionalism, directing traffic and communications with the competence of someone with years of experience rather than days. As they entered the final fields of the Ramirez harvest, Jake felt the familiar mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration that came with completing difficult work under pressure. Both combines were performing flawlessly, their teams were working together with remarkable coordination, and the grain quality remained excellent despite the accelerated pace. Elena's contribution to the final push was particularly impressive, as she took full responsibility for operating the primary combine while Jake moved to coordinate between machines and oversee the last critical decisions about grain handling and storage. Her confidence and competence were testament to both her natural abilities and the quality of instruction she had received from their informal farming school. The first drops of rain began falling just as both combines completed their final passes through the last Ramirez wheat field. The timing was so close that Jake suspected they would be discussing this harvest for years to come, using it as an example of successful cooperation under extreme pressure. Rosa stood in the farmyard watching the grain trucks complete their final loads, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her family's farm had been saved through the generosity and hard work of people who had been strangers just 3 days earlier. The sight of her stored grain, safely protected from the approaching storm, represented the continuation of a legacy that had seemed certain to end in foreclosure. Carlos embraced his mother and his niece as the rain began falling more steadily, the storm that had threatened their harvest now providing welcome moisture for next year's planting. The combine harvesters were quickly moved to shelter, their work complete after 3 days of intensive operation that had brought in 3 separate harvests totaling more than 1,500 acres. As the group gathered in the Ramirez farmhouse to wait out the storm and celebrate their success, Jake reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in such a short time. Emma had discovered genuine passion for agricultural operations management. Elena had reconnected with her farming heritage while advancing her corporate career. And their entire community had demonstrated the kind of cooperation that made rural life resilient and sustainable. But the most significant changes, Jake realized, were still to come. The Harvest Cooperative had created relationships and demonstrated possibilities that would continue to influence their community long after the grain was sold and the equipment was put away for winter. They had proved that individual farms could work together to overcome challenges that would defeat them separately, and that knowledge would change how they approached future obstacles. Outside, the storm that had threatened their harvest was now providing the moisture that would nourish next year's crops. Inside the warm farmhouse, surrounded by people who had become family through shared risk and mutual support, Jake felt the deep satisfaction that came from work well done and communities strengthened through cooperation. Elena stood at the window watching the rain, her expression thoughtful as she contemplated the choices that lay ahead. The corporate promotion offered financial security and professional advancement, but her 3 days on the farm had reconnected her with values and relationships that money couldn't purchase. Tomorrow would bring new decisions and different challenges, but tonight there was celebration, gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction of a harvest safely completed through the power of people working together toward a common goal. The storm could rage outside, but inside there was warmth, community, and the knowledge that sometimes the most important crops weren't the ones growing in fields, but the relationships cultivated between people who understood the value of helping each other through difficult times. The morning after the storm dawned with crystal clear skies and the crisp, clean air that follows intense weather systems. Jake stepped out onto the Ramirez farmhouse porch, coffee cup in hand, to survey the aftermath of their race against nature. The wheat fields that had been golden and full just 24 hours earlier now stood empty, their stubble glistening with moisture from the overnight rain. But, more importantly, the grain bins were full, the equipment was safely stored, and 3 family farms had survived what could have been a devastating season. Elena emerged from the house behind him, also carrying coffee. Her business clothes were placed permanently now, with practical farmware that she had purchased during a quick trip to town the previous evening. The transformation was more than sartorial. Something fundamental had shifted in her bearing and priorities during their intensive 3-day harvest marathon. "I've been thinking about my uncle's offer to stay and help manage the farm operations going forward," she said, settling into one of the wooden chairs that Carlos had built years earlier. "The corporate promotion is appealing, but I keep coming back to what we accomplished here and wondering if there might be something more meaningful I could build." Jake nodded thoughtfully, understanding the pull that agricultural work could exert on people who discovered its unique combination of meaningful purpose, community connection, and tangible results. The contrast with corporate environments was stark, and many people who experienced farming found it difficult to return to more abstract forms of work. Rosa appeared in the doorway, moving with the energetic purposefulness of someone who had been liberated from months of crushing worry. The successful harvest had not only saved her farm but restored her confidence in the future, and she was already making plans for next year's planting and improvements to their grain storage facilities. "Mija," she said to Elena, "your grandfather always believed that the land chooses its own caretakers. Perhaps it has chosen you, and this harvest was just the way of making that clear." Emma's voice called from inside the house, where she had been monitoring agricultural commodity prices and coordinating the grain sales that would convert their harvest into the cash flow needed to pay bills and plan for the future. Her expertise in agricultural marketing had developed rapidly during their harvest cooperative, and she was proving invaluable in maximizing the financial returns from their hard work. "Dad," she called, "you need to see these price quotes. The grain elevator is offering premium prices for our wheat because of the quality, and there's a specialty market buyer interested in Mrs. Ramirez's heritage varieties that could significantly increase our profits." Jake felt a surge of pride at Emma's growing expertise, but also a recognition that she was developing skills that would serve her well, whether she chose to continue farming or pursue other career paths. The Harvest Cooperative had provided her with real-world experience in operations management, financial planning, and crisis coordination that no classroom could duplicate. Carlos joined them on the porch, carrying his own coffee and a folder full of documents that he had been reviewing since dawn. His experience with large-scale agricultural operations had proven invaluable during their harvest, but he had also been learning from their small-scale cooperative approach and considering how similar principles might be applied in other contexts. "I've been running some numbers on what we accomplished here," he said, opening his folder to reveal detailed financial analyses and efficiency calculations. "Our three-farm cooperative not only saved all of our operations but actually achieved better per-acre yields and lower operating costs than any of us would have managed working independently." The implications of Carlos's analysis were significant, suggesting that their emergency cooperation had revealed principles that could be applied more broadly to strengthen small farming operations. Jake had always believed in the value of neighbor helping neighbor, but their harvest had demonstrated that cooperation could provide tangible economic benefits as well as social support. Elena looked up from her coffee with sudden inspiration. "What if we formalized this approach? Not just for emergency situations, but as a regular business model that helps small farms compete with larger operations by sharing equipment, expertise, and marketing power?" Rosa smiled at her granddaughter's enthusiasm, recognizing the same entrepreneurial spirit that had driven previous generations of their family to build successful farming operations. But she also understood that sustainable businesses required careful planning and realistic assessment of challenges as well as opportunities. "It's a beautiful idea, Mija, but it would require significant coordination and trust between families who are used to working independently. Not every farmer would be comfortable sharing equipment and decision-making the way we did during our emergency." Tommy appeared around the corner of the house, having spent the early morning hours performing detailed maintenance on both combine harvesters after their intensive 3-day operation. His mechanical expertise had been crucial to their success, and his enthusiasm for agricultural technology was evident in the careful attention he paid to equipment care and optimization. "Actually," he said, joining their discussion, "I think Mrs. Ramirez raises an important point about trust and coordination. But I've been researching cooperative farming models used in other countries, and there are proven systems for managing shared equipment and collective decision-making that might work here." Jake appreciated Tommy's research-oriented approach to their planning, recognizing that successful business ventures required both inspiration and practical implementation strategies. The young man's combination of mechanical skills and analytical thinking made him an ideal contributor to any formalized cooperative arrangement. Emma appeared in the doorway with her laptop, having clearly been listening to their conversation while continuing her grain marketing work. "I've been looking at some numbers too," she said, "and I think there's definitely potential for a formal cooperative. But we'd need to start small and prove the concept before trying to expand to other farms." The discussion that followed was intense and detailed, covering everything from legal structures and equipment ownership to scheduling protocols and profit-sharing arrangements. Jake found himself impressed by the sophistication of the ideas being generated by their group, and he began to see how their emergency harvest could indeed become the foundation for something larger and more sustainable. Elena's phone rang, interrupting their planning session with a call from her Denver supervisor. The conversation was brief but significant, and when she hung up, her expression was thoughtful rather than excited. "They've offered me the promotion with a substantial salary increase and the flexibility to work remotely from here," she announced. "I would be developing renewable energy partnerships with agricultural communities which could actually support the kind of cooperative farming we're discussing." The offer represented an ideal compromise between Elena's corporate career and her growing connection to agricultural work, but Jake could see that she was still weighing the decision carefully. The past 3 days had changed her perspective on what constituted meaningful work, and the corporate world no longer held the same appeal it once had. Rosa placed a gentle hand on her granddaughter's arm. "Whatever you decide, Micha, remember that opportunities like this one don't come around often. The land will always be here, but the chance to build something new and important may not wait." Carlos nodded agreement with his mother's wisdom. "Elena, you have a unique perspective now, understanding both corporate operations and agricultural realities. That combination could be invaluable for developing programs that actually help farming communities, rather than just looking good in sustainability reports." Jake watched Elena process the advice and encouragement from her family, recognizing the weight of a decision that would influence not only her own future, but potentially the development of their cooperative farming concept. Her corporate connections and analytical skills could provide crucial support for formalizing their collaborative approach. The sound of vehicles arriving in the farmyard interrupted their discussion, and Jake looked up to see several cars turning into the driveway. Margaret Henderson emerged from the first vehicle, followed by neighbors and community members who had heard about their successful harvest cooperative and wanted to learn more about their approach. "Word travels fast in farming communities," Margaret announced with a smile, "and there's a lot of interest in what you folks accomplished here. Several farmers are wondering if this kind of cooperation might help them deal with their own equipment and financial challenges." Jake felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at the realization that their harvest cooperative had attracted broader attention. Success often brought new opportunities, but it also created expectations and pressures that could complicate future planning and decision-making. Elena stood up, her corporate training evident in the way she naturally assumed a leadership role when faced with interested stakeholders. "Perhaps we should organize a community meeting to discuss the possibilities and challenges of expanded cooperative farming in our area," she suggested. "We could share what we learned and get input from other farmers about their interests and concerns." The suggestion was immediately popular, and within minutes they were planning a community-wide meeting to be held at the local Grange Hall the following weekend. Jake found himself designated as one of the primary speakers, despite his preference for working behind the scenes rather than promoting himself or his ideas. As the visitors departed with promises to spread word about the upcoming meeting, Jake reflected on how quickly their simple equipment-sharing arrangement had evolved into something with broader implications for their agricultural community. Emma was already making notes about presentation materials and logistics, while Carlos was drafting an agenda that would cover both practical implementation details and larger questions about cooperative farming models. Elena's decision about the corporate promotion became even more complex as the scope of their potential cooperative expanded. Her skills in project management and strategic planning would be invaluable for developing a formal organization, but the Denver job offered financial security and professional advancement that would be difficult to replicate in rural Nebraska. That evening, as they gathered around the Ramirez dinner table for what had become a traditional end-of-day planning session, Elena announced her decision with quiet confidence. "I'm going to accept the promotion," she said, "but with modifications to the job description that will allow me to use our cooperative as a pilot project for renewable energy partnerships with agricultural communities. If we can demonstrate that this model works, it could become a template for programs in other regions." Rosa's face broke into a wide smile at her granddaughter's news, clearly pleased that Elena had found a way to combine her professional advancement with her growing commitment to agricultural community development. Carlos nodded approvingly, recognizing the strategic value of having corporate support for their cooperative farming initiative. Jake felt relieved that Elena had found a solution that honored both her career goals and her family connections, understanding that sustainable community development required people who could bridge different worlds and perspectives. Her unique position could provide crucial support for their expanding cooperative efforts. Emma looked up from her presentation notes with obvious excitement. "This means we'll have resources for developing proper business systems and maybe even technology platforms that could help other cooperative groups get started, she said. We could actually have impact beyond our own community. The realization that their emergency harvest could catalyse broader changes in how small farms approached cooperation and mutual support was both thrilling and daunting. Jake had always believed in the power of neighbors helping neighbors, but he was discovering that sometimes individual actions could have implications far beyond their original scope. Tommy raised his hand with the enthusiasm of someone who had discovered a genuine passion. "If we're really going to do this," he said, "I'd like to volunteer to coordinate the equipment maintenance and scheduling systems. I've been researching agricultural technology cooperatives, and I think I could help design systems that would support much larger groups of farms." The evening planning session extended well past their usual bedtime as they worked through the practical details of organizing a community meeting and preparing presentations that would explain their cooperative model to potentially skeptical neighbors. Jake found himself both excited and nervous about the response they might receive from farmers who were used to fierce independence and might be wary of collective approaches. As the meeting finally wound down and people began departing for their own homes, Elena lingered to help with cleanup and express her gratitude one final time for the experience that had changed her life's direction. "Mr. Thompson," she said as they stacked dishes in the sink, "I want you to know that this harvest taught me more about leadership and community than any corporate training program ever could. You took an enormous risk to help people you barely knew, and it ended up creating something none of us could have imagined." Jake smiled at Elena's reflection, thinking about the unpredictable ways that simple acts of kindness could grow into something larger and more significant than anyone anticipated. The decision to lend his combine harvester to a desperate stranger had indeed led to changes that none of them could have foreseen. "Sometimes the most important decisions are the ones that feel impossible when you're making them," he replied. "Helping your family felt like the right thing to do, even though it put our own harvest at risk. I'm grateful that it worked out well for everyone involved." As Elena drove away into the clear night, Jake stood in the farmyard looking up at the stars that were brilliant in the unpolluted rural sky. The events of the past 4 days had demonstrated the power of cooperation and mutual support, but they had also revealed possibilities for the future that extended far beyond their immediate farming community. Emma appeared beside him, following his gaze toward the stars with the thoughtful expression she had inherited from her mother. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think I understand now why Mom loved teaching so much. It's not just about sharing knowledge, it's about helping people discover possibilities they didn't know existed." Jake put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, grateful for the wisdom and maturity she had developed through their shared challenges. The Harvest Cooperative had not only saved 3 family farms, but had also provided Emma with real-world experience that would influence her future choices and career development. Tomorrow would bring the complex work of organizing a community meeting and preparing presentations that could persuade skeptical neighbors to consider cooperative approaches to farming challenges. But tonight, there was quiet satisfaction in work well done and anticipation for the new possibilities that their success had revealed. The following week passed in a blur of preparation for the community meeting, with Elena coordinating between her new corporate responsibilities and her commitment to developing their cooperative farming initiative. Her supervisor in Denver had been enthusiastic about using their harvest success as a case study for rural sustainability programs, providing resources and support that none of them had expected. Emma had thrown herself into creating presentation materials with the same thoroughness she brought to her academic work, but now her research focused on practical questions about equipment sharing, profit distribution, and coordination protocols that could make or break cooperative farming ventures. Carlos divided his time between his regular job responsibilities and developing detailed financial models that demonstrated the economic benefits of cooperative farming for small operations. His corporate agricultural experience provided credibility with farmers who might otherwise be skeptical of ideas that seemed too theoretical or idealistic. Tommy had become their technology coordinator, researching software platforms and communication systems that could support larger cooperative groups while maintaining the personal relationships that had made their own harvest successful. His enthusiasm for agricultural innovation was infectious, and he was already developing plans for equipment modifications that could improve efficiency. Rosa spent her time reaching out to neighboring farms through the informal networks that connected rural communities, gauging interest and addressing concerns about cooperative farming arrangements. Her reputation for practical wisdom and honest dealing gave her credibility with farmers who might be wary of outsiders promoting new business models. Jake found himself in the unexpected role of spokesperson for their cooperative. preparing presentations that would explain their approach to farmers, community leaders, and potentially even state agricultural officials who had expressed interest in their success. The attention was flattering, but also somewhat overwhelming for someone who preferred working with equipment to speaking in public. The community meeting was scheduled for Saturday evening at the local Grange Hall, a venue that had hosted countless farm-related gatherings over the decades. The building's worn wooden floors and practical lighting created an atmosphere that was both humble and dignified, appropriate for serious discussions about the future of local agriculture. As people began arriving for the meeting, Jake was pleased to see the diversity of attendees, including not only local farmers but also agricultural extension agents, representatives from the State Department of Agriculture, and even a few reporters who had heard about their cooperative through Elena's corporate connections. Margaret Henderson had organized a potluck dinner before the formal presentations, providing an opportunity for informal conversations and relationship building that would be crucial for any future cooperative efforts. The food was abundant and excellent, reflecting the agricultural abundance of their region and the cooking skills that were still common in rural communities. Elena opened the formal presentations with an overview of their harvest cooperative, explaining how a simple equipment-sharing arrangement had evolved into something larger and more significant. Her corporate presentation skills were evident, but she had adapted her approach to suit an agricultural audience that valued practical results over theoretical concepts. Carlos followed with detailed financial analysis, showing how their cooperation had reduced costs and improved efficiency for all three participating farms. His numbers were compelling, demonstrating that collective approaches could provide tangible economic benefits even for farmers who were primarily motivated by independence and self-reliance. Tommy's presentation on technology and coordination systems generated significant interest, particularly among younger farmers who were comfortable with digital communication and eager to explore innovations that could improve their operations. His enthusiasm for agricultural technology was evident, and his practical experience gave credibility to his suggestions. Emma's presentation on organizational structures and decision-making protocols addressed many of the concerns that farmers had expressed about cooperative arrangements. Her research had identified proven models for managing shared resources and collective decision-making that could preserve individual autonomy while enabling group cooperation. Jake concluded the presentations with reflections on the broader implications of their cooperative experience, emphasizing the importance of maintaining rural communities and preserving family farming traditions through innovative approaches to traditional challenges. His message was simple but powerful. Cooperation had been the foundation of rural communities for generations, and formalizing that cooperation could help small farms survive in an increasingly challenging agricultural economy. The question-and-answer session that followed was intense and detailed, covering everything from legal liability and insurance considerations to scheduling conflicts and personality disputes that could disrupt cooperative arrangements. The audience clearly understood both the potential benefits and the practical challenges of implementing cooperative farming on a larger scale. Several farmers expressed immediate interest in joining an expanded cooperative, while others wanted more time to consider the implications and discuss the possibilities with their families. The response was more positive than Jake had dared to hope, but he also recognized that moving from initial interest to actual implementation would require careful planning and ongoing relationship management. Margaret Henderson stood up during the final discussion period to offer her enthusiastic endorsement of the cooperative concept. "Without the help of these folks," she said, gesturing toward Jake and his team, "I would have lost my farm this year. Cooperation isn't just good business, it's good community, and that's what makes rural life worth preserving." Her testimonial was followed by similar endorsements from other community members who had witnessed their harvest success and understood its implications for the broader agricultural community. The meeting concluded with the formation of a planning committee that would work on developing a formal structure for an expanded cooperative arrangement. Elena volunteered to coordinate the planning committee's work, drawing on her corporate project management experience while continuing her new role with the renewable energy company. Her unique position would allow her to access resources and expertise that could accelerate their cooperative development while maintaining local control and agricultural focus. As people began departing from the Grange Hall, Jake felt both exhausted and energized by the evening's success. The positive response had exceeded his expectations, but he also understood that the real work was just beginning. Translating enthusiasm into functional cooperative arrangements would require sustained effort and careful attention to the dozens of practical details that could make or break their initiative. Emma helped him load the presentation materials into their truck, her expression thoughtful as she processed the evening's discussions and the commitments they had made to their community. "Dad," she said as they drove home through the quiet rural night, "I think tonight changed everything for our family and our community. This feels like the beginning of something really important." Jake nodded agreement, recognizing that their simple act of lending equipment to a neighbor in need had indeed catalyzed changes that would influence their community for years to come. The Harvest Cooperative had demonstrated the power of people working together toward common goals, and their community meeting had shown that appetite existed for expanded cooperation and mutual support. 3 months later, on a crisp December morning, Jake stood in his workshop reviewing the plans for a new equipment storage and maintenance facility that would serve their expanded agricultural cooperative. The building would house shared machinery, provide maintenance services, and offer meeting space for the 23 families who had joined their formalized cooperative arrangement. Elena's renewable energy company had provided funding for the facility as part of their rural sustainability initiative, while the state agricultural department had contributed technical assistance and regulatory guidance. The combination of corporate support and government resources had accelerated their development timeline while preserving local control over cooperative operations. Emma had deferred her college enrollment for a year to help manage the cooperative's launch, gaining real-world experience in business operations that would complement her eventual academic studies. Her role as communications coordinator had expanded to include marketing, member services, and strategic planning responsibilities that were developing her leadership capabilities. Carlos had negotiated a flexible work arrangement with his corporate employer that allowed him to split his time between his regular job and serving as technical director for their cooperative. His agricultural engineering expertise was proving invaluable for equipment optimization and operational efficiency improvements. Tommy had been hired as the cooperative's full-time equipment manager, responsible for maintenance scheduling, operator training, and technology integration that was improving their coordination and efficiency. His enthusiasm for agricultural innovation had made him a natural leader among the younger members who were eager to explore new approaches to traditional farming challenges. Rosa continued to serve as an informal advisor and community liaison, using her decades of farming experience and extensive network of relationships to help resolve conflicts and maintain the cooperative spirit that had made their initial success possible. Her wisdom and practical knowledge were considered invaluable by members who appreciated both innovation and tradition. The morning mail brought a letter from the United States Department of Agriculture announcing that their cooperative had been selected as a pilot project for a new federal program supporting innovative approaches to small farm sustainability. The recognition would bring additional resources and national attention to their work, but it also carried expectations for documentation and replication that would challenge their informal, relationship-based approach. Elena called from Denver with news that her renewable energy company wanted to expand their rural partnership program to other states, using their Nebraska cooperative as a model for similar initiatives. The proposal would provide significant funding and technical support, but it would also require them to develop standardized procedures and training materials that could be implemented by other communities. Jake felt mixed emotions about the growing attention and expansion opportunities, recognizing that success often brought complexity and external pressures that could compromise the personal relationships and community focus that had made their cooperative work. But he also understood that broader impact required accepting some level of formalization and outside involvement. Emma appeared in the workshop doorway with a folder full of membership applications from farmers in neighboring counties who had heard about their cooperative and wanted to explore similar arrangements in their own areas. The interest was flattering but also concerning, as expanding beyond their immediate community would require new systems and potentially different approaches to relationship management and decision-making. "Dad," she said, settling into the chair where so many important conversations had taken place over the past months, "I think we need to be really careful about how fast we grow and how much we change." What made our harvest work was the personal relationships and the willingness to take risks for each other. Jake nodded appreciation for Emma's insight, recognizing that she had identified the core challenge facing their cooperative as it attracted attention and opportunities for expansion. Preserving their community-based approach while accessing resources and support from larger organizations would require careful balance and constant attention to their founding principles. The phone rang with a call from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell their story as part of a series about innovative approaches to rural economic development. The exposure could help promote cooperative farming concepts and attract additional support, but it would also bring scrutiny and expectations that could complicate their relatively simple approach to neighbor helping neighbor. As Jake considered the various opportunities and challenges facing their cooperative, he reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with Elena's desperate request for help with her family's harvest. What had started as a simple act of community support had grown into something with implications far beyond their immediate farming operation. But at its core, their success still depended on the same principles that had guided rural communities for generations. The willingness to help neighbors in need, the understanding that individual success depended on community strength, and the belief that working together could overcome challenges that would defeat people working alone. Elena returned from Denver for the cooperative's first annual meeting, where members would review their initial year's performance and make decisions about future expansion and development. Her experience bridging corporate and agricultural worlds had proved invaluable for managing external relationships while preserving their community focus. The meeting was held in the new cooperative facility, a modern building that somehow managed to feel both professional and welcoming. The agenda covered financial performance, equipment utilization, member satisfaction, and strategic planning for the coming year, but the atmosphere remained informal and collaborative. Jake's presentation on their first year's achievements was met with enthusiastic applause from members who had benefited from shared equipment, reduced costs, and improved efficiency. But more importantly, they had maintained and strengthened the community relationships that made rural life meaningful and sustainable. Rosa was recognized with a special award for her contributions to the cooperative success, acknowledging both her practical wisdom and her role in maintaining the community spirit that distinguished their organization from purely business-oriented agricultural enterprises. Her acceptance speech was brief but eloquent, emphasizing the importance of preserving both innovation and tradition in their approach to farming. As the meeting concluded, with plans for the coming year and commitments to continued cooperation and mutual support, Jake felt deep satisfaction with what they had accomplished together. Their harvest cooperative had indeed grown into something larger and more significant than any of them had originally envisioned, but it had retained the personal relationships and community focus that made it meaningful. Elena approached him after the meeting with news that her renewable energy company had approved funding for similar cooperative projects in 3 other states, with their Nebraska operations serving as the template and training center for new initiatives. The expansion would provide resources and opportunities for broader impact, but it would also test their ability to maintain their community-centered approach while supporting other groups. "Mr. Thompson," she said, using the formal address that had given way to friendship over the months of working together, "I want you to know that this experience has changed not only my career, but my understanding of what makes work meaningful. Thank you for taking the risk to help a stranger and showing me what real community looks like." Jake smiled at Elena's gratitude, thinking about the unpredictable ways that simple acts of kindness could grow into something transformative for entire communities. Their harvest cooperative had demonstrated that individual generosity, combined with community cooperation, could create possibilities that none of them could have achieved working alone. As members departed from their annual meeting into the crisp winter evening, Jake stood in the doorway of their cooperative facility, looking out over the fields that would soon be planted with another year's crops. The cycle of agriculture would continue, but now it would be supported by the formal cooperative arrangements and community relationships that had grown from their emergency harvest. Emma joined him in the doorway, her expression thoughtful as she considered the year ahead and the role she would play in continuing to develop their cooperative. Her decision to defer college had provided invaluable real-world experience, but it had also opened possibilities for combining academic study with practical community development work. "Dad," she said quietly, "I think I finally understand what Mom meant when she talked about work that makes a lasting difference. This feels like something we'll still be talking about years from now. And not just because it saved our farms, but because it showed what people can accomplish when they decide to help each other." Jake put his arm around his daughter's shoulders, grateful for the wisdom and perspective she had developed through their shared challenges and successes. The Harvest Cooperative had indeed grown beyond their original emergency response into something that would influence their community for generations to come. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities as they continued building their cooperative and supporting similar initiatives in other communities. But tonight, there was quiet satisfaction in work well done. and community relationships strengthened through shared commitment to helping neighbors succeed. The stars were brilliant in the clear winter sky, the same stars that had witnessed generations of farming families working together to build sustainable communities in rural America. Their harvest cooperative was simply the latest chapter in that ongoing story of cooperation, mutual support, and the belief that neighbors helping neighbors could overcome any challenge. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.